What if I told you a foreigner once washed ashore in samurai Japan, carrying a prophecy no one believed? That man, Edward Harrington, brought to life here by Leonardo DiCaprio, would rise from exile to wear the crown of a warrior king. The prophecy of a foreign king. Night rolled over the archipelago like a black tide. Wind pressed its cold face against the mountains and combed the cedar forests until they murmured. Monks in cliffside temples pinched wicks to darkness and let the bronze bells sigh once, twice, as if to warn the sleeping valleys below. On the coast, the sea grew teeth. White, biting crests rose and fell, and boats became toys at the mercy of an unseen hand. From the horizon came a crippled ship, ribs exposed, sails clawed into ribbons. Lightning unveiled it in stuttering flashes mast, bent like a wounded spear, hull groaning with every wave. It was not a vessel so much as stubborn memory, refusing to sink. In its belly, among brine and broken crates, a man opened his eyes to the dark. He clawed for breath and steadied himself against timbers slick with salt. The ocean spoke through the hull in hollow thuds. The name he once wore like armor had been sanded down by exile, but it still flared within him like a coal. Edward Harrington, the man the world would one day remember as Leonardo DiCaprio's character in this tale. He hauled himself onto the tilted deck and stared into the roar. A wall of water eclipsed the heavens. It lifted the ship the way a father lifts a child, and then dashed it down without tenderness. Wood screamed. Nails surrendered. The deck, the mast, the night everything split. Harrington rose with the wave and fell through a broken seam, swallowed by a black throat. In the ocean's mouth, he spun weightless, soundless, until gravity remembered him. His body struck something solid shore. Rock, fate, and instinct clawed out of him. Fingers found rough stones. His ribs burned with each breath a small victory. He crawled until the tide could not reach him and collapsed where the land accepted the wreckage. Dawn found him there. Gray light seeped into the world and showed him a coast of volcanic rock and stubborn grass. The sea licked its wounds and pretended innocence. Gulls circled and scolded. His first clear thought came with pain. He was alive. His second followed with dread. He was nowhere he recognized. Footsteps arrived like questions. Voices followed sharp, clipped syllables dense with suspicion. Shapes cut themselves from fog. Fishermen in straw raincoats, men with eyes, narrowed by wind and salt, and behind them a handful of armored retainers whose hands rested on hilts as if their palms were magnets and the steel the pole star. Harrington tried to stand and failed. The nearest retainer stepped forward with measured disdain and tapped the pale stranger with the scabbard, testing for life. Life groaned. Restraints appeared with the efficiency of habit-rough rope at the wrists, a wooden collar pinched around the neck, a prod to the shoulder that meant move. He moved. The village was a knot of rooftops tied together by footpaths and smoke. Children peered from doorways, the brave ones stepping into the morning just enough to sneer at the foreign specter who had washed ashore. This tall, sea-tangled ghost. An old woman traced a charm in the air. A dog barked once and then decided against it. Harrington swallowed the taste of blood and brine and kept his eyes level. Pride was a thin blanket against cold, but he refused to give it up. Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal of Harrington in this moment is a man reduced to essentials: breath, balance, resolve. The retainers did not keep him long in the village. They pushed him uphill along a path that flirted with the cliff's edge. The world expanded terraces of rice paddies like mirrors laid into the earth. Distant smoke where other villages rose, and farther still, mountains that looked as if the gods had tried to fold the land and given up halfway. At the crest, a fortress revealed itself. Layered stone, timber bones, tiled roofs like armored scales. Flags hung soggy in the mooring. Drums throbbed once to announce their arrival. The gate opened its layered mouth, and Harrington entered another animal entirely. They cleansed him bucket water, thrown without ceremony, the kind that shocks a man back into his skin. They stripped him of what little remained from his voyage. A sodden coat, a rust-salt belt, a token medallion worn smooth by worry. Hands catalogued him like an inventory. Scars on the forearm, callus on the sword hand, the healed break of a knuckle, the particular stiffness of a man too long at sea. The physicians prodded, the scribes stared. The guard smiled exactly once, when they tightened the collar a fraction beyond necessary. Midday came with a thunder of sandals across wood. The audience hall opened long and polished, a rectangle of power and silence. Tatami mats drank footfall softly. Lanterns sweetened the air with the faint smoke of oil. At the far end, not on a throne, but on a cushion raised by taste and threat, the Lord waited. He was not a large man, but gravity preferred him. A sword lay across the floor within reach, not as decoration, but as punctuation. Harrington was forced to kneel. The wooden collar bit the back of his neck. He felt the room study him the way falcons study a mouse-curious, hungry, professionally detached. The language poured around him, lyrical, impenetrable. A translator young, careful, eyes too quick stepped forward and began to braid meaning between worlds. Questions, simple as knives. From where? With whom? Why here? Harrington offered truth pruned of detail. A ship, a storm. No malice in his arrival, only luck and cruelty. He accepted that truth is just one spice in a stew of politics. Silence sealed the last translation. The Lord considered the foreign problem as if it were a chess piece carved from unfamiliar bone. He did not dignify the decision with explanation. A gesture, small and specific, sent Harrington not to a dungeon, nor to a road of exile, but to a courtyard washed with sand and shadow, where trading posts pocked with scars stood like a row of veterans. Retainers filed in to watch. The curious came on plausible errands and stayed. The old soldiers sat with the patience of whetstones. One man stepped to the center armor lacquered black, with the matte sheen of rain, hair-bound, face arranged in a serenity earned, not inherited. His sword remained sheathed. He bowed to the Lord's distant presence, and then to the foreigner as one bows to a problem they intend to solve. A weapon was placed in Harrington's hands. A spear broken mid-shaft during some earlier lesson, its wood splintered and sanded smooth at both ends. He tested its weight and balance and met its indifference. The retainer opposite him drew his blade in a single breath of steel and light. It did not sing. It simply existed, thin as decision. The first exchange belonged to the resident of the courtyard. His strike was a conversation starter testing range, speed, that treacherous miracle called timing. Harrington moved on instinct older than language. He had learned weapons the way some learn prayer. Repetition, bruises, the private mathematics of survival. He softened his stance to accommodate the sand, let the broken haft become an extension of bone, caught steel with wood, and redirected it not with strength, but with surrender. The room exhaled as one organism. Surprise was a flavor rarely served here. The samurai recovered with grace, step-match to breath. The second exchange came like winter, inevitable and unsentimental, a feint that promised the shoulder but married the hip. Harrington bent around it and felt cloth whisper as it survived by half an inch. He did not return a strike. He returned a question. What happens when an expected answer refuses to arrive? The spear dipped, spun, struck for the wrist. A courtesy to test respect rather than sever it. The samurai let it pass beneath a fold of air and answered with a downward slice that would have ended most conversations. Harrington's hands slid, one palm anchored, the other free, and he posted the broken spear into the sand, used the earth as a hinge, and transformed the blade's descent into a circuit around his body. Steel glanced, notched a shaving from wood, and found itself describing a harmless circle. Silence arrived, astonished and attentive. The old soldiers leaned a fraction forward. The lord's hand, which had rested on the sword like a cat drowsing on a windowsill, uncurled one finger. Third exchanges are always truth. The samurai bowed the smallest degree, acknowledgment acknowledged. He slid left, changed rhythm, asked for the foreigner's balance, and tried to purchase it with a price too high to haggle. Harrington paid in sweat instead. He entered the strike, crowded it, dissolved its geometry with proximity, and with a twist that relied on a shipman's knowledge of leverage, he hooked the spear's haft under the guard and levered up. The katana left the hand that owned it and hung in the air as if uncertain of gravity, then returned to the earth as a man might return to a home he did not expect to see again. Harrington did not pick up the dropped blade. He stepped back from its reach. He planted the broken spear as one might plant a flag that claims nothing but dignity. In that moment, mercy became heavier than victory. A murmur trembled through the onlookers, not joy, not anger, but the collective understanding that they had witnessed a truth rearrange itself. Here stood a man who should have died and did not. A man who could have killed and did not. The samurai whose sword lay on the sand measured the foreigner with new arithmetic, then bowed to him deeper this time, because there are currencies beyond coin. Restraint, respect, the refusal to humiliate a worthy foe. The Lord's voice, when it finally traveled the room, was quiet enough to make the lantern flames seem loud. The translator offered its meaning in careful syllables. The foreigner would live. He would be housed, watched, fed enough that hunger sharpened, but did not embitter. He would be taught the rules of a world not obliged to explain itself. And he would be tested again, not for spectacle, but for pattern. One miracle could be accident. Two suggest character. More than that suggest fate. That night, the compound discovered its newest ghost did not rattle chains. He moved with the economy of a man whose body had learned to negotiate with pain. The shed assigned to him was spare. Pallet, blanket thin as honesty, a bowl, a cup, a window no larger than a book. Through it he watched the moon balance on the eaves and listened to bamboo knock itself into music. Somewhere a flute found a minor key that understood the weight of arrival. Leonardo DiCaprio's Harrington lay still and mapped his ribs by the ache, counted breaths. Set in tension like a stone, endure, observe, learn. Morning rose like a white pennant. The compound breathed in unison. Clatter of training poles, the thud of bare feet on packed earth, the call and answer of instructors and students. Harrington was brought to the edge of the courtyard and told nothing. He read the curriculum in bodies, stances that taught humility, drills that tutored patience, cuts that apologized for nothing. The samurai from the duel, his hair black as a well, his expression clean of vanity, stood at the center and called the rhythm. When eyes met, neither lingered. Recognition is sometimes a blade with two edges. Both men chose its handle. By midday, a boy brought food, a triangle of rice, pickled root, soup that warmed the bones back into their sockets. The boy was not a servant by birth, but by assignment, a training messenger whose curiosity overflowed his caution. He stared the way children stare at fires and storms. Harrington ate without haste, then lifted the bowl toward the boy in thanks that required no translation. The boy, startled, half-bowed, fled, returned an hour later with water, lingered, absorbed the shape of the foreigner's gratitude, like a plant drinking light. In some histories, revolutions begin with manifestos. In others, with quiet courtesies. Afternoon brought a different test. Harrington was handed a wooden sword blunt, heavy, honest, and led to a line of straw bundles bound to poles. Inanimate students that forgive mistakes. The instructor did not instruct. He simply stood near and let the air thicken with expectation. Harrington set his feet and found them ignorant. He corrected them with the humility of a man whose body has learned many alphabets and is unashamed to study another. The first cut was a shrug, the second an apology. The third carried intention, and therefore consequence. Fibers parted, straw fell. The instructor blinked once in the long language of approval. Days perhaps only 3, perhaps already 10 braided themselves into a rope strong enough to hang habit on. Harrington learned the courtyards by their shadows and the watchmen by the music of their armor. He learned that tea, poured slowly, could repair more than thirst, and that silence, applied carefully, could be a teacher equal to pain. He learned that the world within the walls had rules more precise than the angles of a sword. How to bow to the threshold, as well as the owner, how to speak with the body when the mouth could not, how to lose without surrendering and win without taking. Beyond the walls, rumor multiplied like spring. Fishermen traded weather and whispers. A foreigner had come out of the sea. A demon, a warning, a good omen, an omen of good for one clan and ill for another. In tea-houses, men speculated as if the future were a board game, and they had invented the dice. Priests remembered a passage in an old scroll that spoke of a stranger from beyond the horizon who would bind spears and scythes beneath a single banner. The scroll did not name a season or a face. Prophecies are cowards like that. Within his cell, Harrington lay awake and let the sea's phantom motion work out of his bones. He measured the shape of his resolve against the dark and found it intact. He let memory interrogate him, his father's hand on his shoulder like an oath, a brother's smile with the crack in it, the quiet arithmetic of the betrayal that had shipped him across the world. He did not indulge grief. He pressed it flat and used it as a map. He was not here by choice, but he was not here by accident either. Men are delivered by storms, but they arrive by decisions. The next summoning came at dusk. The courtyard wore a red skin, lanterns waking one by one like patient eyes. The Lord stood in the veranda's shadow with his counselors arranged the way stars arrange themselves around a moon. The samurai instructor stepped forward with 2 wooden swords and handed one to Harrington. No spectators today, only witnesses. The duel began without ceremony and bloomed immediately into honesty. Strike, parry, step, breath. The rhythm established itself, and then refused to be predictable. Twice the instructor trapped Harrington as blade, and released it as a parent releases a child at the end of a lesson. Twice Harrington answered not with stubbornness, but with revision, changing stance, changing distance, changing mind. When the last exchange ended, both men stood within a breath of each other, wood crossed, sweat translating labor into salt. A bow equal, exact closed the book. The Lord's counselors treated with each other in low voices, weighing qualities that cannot be measured on scales. Adaptability, restraint, the kind of courage that wastes nothing. The Lord made a choice that would ripple out from this polished square of earth until it touched villages and valleys and men who had not yet been born. The foreigner would be given a teacher, a place not only to sleep, but to belong conditionally. Not trust, that was a treasure with a slow key, but opportunity. The samurai instructor accepted the charge with the calm of someone who knows that steel becomes useful through friction and fire. As the courtyard emptied, the boy with the water pot appeared again, hovering at the edge of duty. Harrington took the cup, drank, and returned it with both hands. The boy's mouth bent upward at one corner, an expression, not yet a smile, but rehearsing for it. Harrington watched the boy vanish into the corridors that braided the fortress together, and then looked up. Above him, the first star negotiated with the evening. Somewhere in the compound, a flute found the same minor key as last night and tried it on again. He stood until his breath had the same length as the music, and then he went to his cell and slept like a man who has spent the day becoming a fraction more himself. By the week's end, the village below the fortress had adjusted to its new distant rumor. Some feared the stranger. Some prayed into the idea of him. A few, the ones who have always known that change arrives wearing their own clothes, sharpened their tools and their wits and resolved to be ready. The old woman who had drawn the charm in the air on the morning of his arrival did so again, not to ward off evil this time, but to seal a wish, that if the gods had indeed rolled a stranger onto their shore, he would come with the kind of fire that warms, and not the kind that burns. And so part one closes, with a man not born of this land being accepted provisionally by it. Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Edward Harrington, has crossed the first gate, from accident to intention, from spectacle to student. The prophecy that had slept in dust has been woken by salt and blood. Whether it speaks truth or merely invites it, no one yet knows. But morning will come, and with it, the first true lessons in a country where honor is a road, not a destination, and where a foreigner may one day be measured, not by where he began, but by the shape of the peace he carves from a season of war. The land of blood and honor. A storm wrecked his ship. A prophecy saved his life. And a nation at war would come to call him their king. This is the story of Edward Harrington Leonardo DiCaprio's most unexpected transformation into the samurai king. The words fall away like an opening curtain. Morning breathes through the fortress eaves, and the courtyard wakes to ritual. Sand is raked in clean lines. Tatami mats are brushed. Practice poles stand in a row like sentinels, each one wearing its history in dents and splinters. Drums low in the distance mark the time when steel and discipline begin their conversation. Edward Harrington, the man carried inland by fate and the sea, portrayed in this retelling by Leonardo DiCaprio, steps onto the packed earth with a wooden sword balanced across his palms. He is allowed no ornament, linen garments, hair tied back with utilitarian neatness, a bandage at the ribs from the ship's tantrum. He bows to the threshold, then to the instructor who waits in the square of light. The instructor is called Masatora, not the loudest blade in a rack, but the sharpest. His voice is measured, his eyes attentive without warmth. He has been ordered to turn a stranger into something useful. He chooses to begin not with the blade, but with the ground. Feet, says Masatora, and the translator echoes. Harrington lowers his gaze and learns that the floor is a teacher. He widens his stance until his weight sinks into the earth like a stake. He discovers that knees are hinges and hips are river stones. Heel lines with heel, toe with toe. Breath sets a tempo the body can obey. Masatora does not praise, he corrects. The wooden sword remains horizontal, a reminder that before a weapon can serve the hand must belong to a balanced man. The first lesson is patience. Harrington swings at straw targets, first too hard, then too high, then with the jitter of a mind that wants to run a mile when a single step will do. Masatora sets a rhythm with the tap of his scabbard. Slow, slower, now. The cut becomes a line drawn with intention, not anger. Straw parts, fibers sigh. The blade follows a path that feels less like violence than geometry. The second lesson is silence. In the crowded courtyard of training bodies, silence is not the absence of sound, but the arrangement of it. Sandals whispering across sand, breath in pairs, wood on wood, like rain on a gate. Harrington's mind, overfull with foreignness, learns to empty itself between heartbeats. In that pocket of quiet, a traveler finds the shape of the next move before the move exists. The third lesson is humility. A boy half his size moves like wind and knocks his wooden sword aside with a flick that feels like an insult, until Harrington realizes it is simply physics in a samurai's clothes. He bows to the boy and receives exactly the bow he offered, no more, no less. In this place, respect is currency, and change is always exact. Days not together. Harrington runs with the dawn until the mountain air becomes a blade that carves his lungs into readiness. He lifts water buckets on a bamboo pole over his shoulders until the ache in his back writes new letters into his posture. He copies the calligrapher's brush strokes at night, tracing the character for G.I. rectitude until the ink nearly runs out, and the meaning begins to seep into the muscles that hold the brush. Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal of Harrington wears effort like armor. The camera of memory lingers on sand-dusted hands, on the sheen of sweat at the temple, on a mouth that begins to forget the taste of complaint. Outside the walls, the land remembers it is at war. Smoke sometimes lifts from the far slopes, where a rival clan tests a village for weakness. Messengers come and go with the clipped grace of hawks. The Lord holds council in a room where maps lie like sleeping animals. Harrington is not invited, but he reads the council's tension in the speed of the kitchen's hands, in the extra watchman at night, in Masatora's sudden insistence that footwork be perfect and tiredness be forgotten. Conflict arrives not with banners, but with a single man. Okabe, a veteran with a scar that has rewritten one side of his face, watches Harrington's drills and finds in them the perfect angle for contempt. He laughs at the foreigner's bow and calls his blade a stick. He steps into the square with a practice sword and invites Harrington to learn faster than he planned. Masatora allows it with a nod that says, "This, too, is a teacher." Okabe comes forward like a storm the land knows. Harrington meets him in a stance that has only recently become his. The first clash is loud enough to turn heads. Harrington's wrists spark with heat. Okabe presses hard, then harder, testing whether the stranger bleeds in the same color as everyone else. Harrington yields, then refuses to, then yields again at just the moment when yielding disarms rather than retreats. The bout lasts longer than contempt expected. Okabe ends it with a shoulder feint and a sweeping cut that threatens the knee. Harrington escapes by a whisper, and with the butt of his sword taps the veteran in the ribs, where the armor is honest about its limits. There is no victory, only a sudden equality. Okabe's contempt retreats to a safer hill. Masatora says nothing, which in this place is almost praise. At meals, Harrington learns the architecture of belonging. He eats beside men who have names like stones and mountains. They speak softly and laugh rarely, but when they do, it is with the open-throated relief of men who know death could interrupt any sentence. The rice is hot, the fish salted into wisdom, a pickled plum a sharp reminder that life is more than tolerable. It is specific. Harrington lifts bowl and cup with both hands. A small nod accompanies each serving. Protocol becomes prayer. In the evenings, he cleans the training space with the others. Brooms whisper. Rakes draw their lines. The courtyards return to stillness, like ponds finding their reflection again after a thrown stone. He learns to love the sound a well-made silence makes. Masatora finally permits steel. The day is ordinary in every way that matters. A pale sky, training dust, the faint smell of cedar from a carpentry bench nearby. Masatora kneels and opens a long lacquered box. Inside rests a katana wrapped in plain cloth. He unveils it the way a priest might lift a sacred text, not to impress, but to honor. The blade catches the light without boasting. Harrington's breath shortens, then lengthens again. He bows, receives, and feels the sword's gravity travel through bone. It is not heavy in the hand, it is heavy in the mind. Name it, Masatora instructs through the translator. A sword unnamed is a stranger even to its bearer. Harrington considers the ocean, the storm, the prophecy he didn't ask for. He thinks of survival that didn't kill mercy. He answers softly, harbor. Masatora repeats the foreign word, trying its edges, accepting the choice with the smallest tilt of chin. Steel behaves differently. It forgives less and teaches more. The first cut through the straw is a letter in a new alphabet. The second is a word. By the 10th, he is writing a sentence that means, I will not waste movement. By the 20th, the sentence admits a second meaning. I know what I am capable of and what I am not. The clan tests him in ways that never announce themselves. A stable hand accidentally leaves a gate unlatched. Harrington secures it without being told and returns the latch to the exact angle it favors. A scribe misplaces a ledger. Harrington finds it beneath the flap of a travel chest and sets it on the table with a bow deeper than the theft warranted. 2 guards forget to relieve him on watch. He stays awake, watches the moon cross the courtyard, and does not flinch when the Lord himself crosses the veranda shadow to measure the foreigner's stubbornness against the cold. Harrington passes these examinations not because he guesses the questions, but because he has begun to understand the language in which the clan speaks when it says nothing. War arrives properly at last. A neighboring clan sends riders to test the Lord's borders. Arrows appear in fence posts like rude punctuation. A farmer does not come home. The drums that usually speak of training now summon armor. Masatora presents Harrington with lacquered plates that fit too well for a first time. The armorer has been measuring him with his eyes for weeks. The helmet sits on his head like a vow. He is not sent to the front line. He rides with a rear-guard escort, a place where new men either learn or vanish. The road into the hills is a long syllable. The forest takes the light and dials it down. Somewhere ahead, Steele is already solving disagreements. Harrington's horse breathes steadily. He praises the animal for being wiser than he is. The first engagement is small and vicious 5 raiders, fast and hungry for an easy kill, and a patrol that denies them the grammar they wanted. Horse's rear. Branches snap like bones. Harrington, S-World compresses to the oval of vision. His helmet allows, and the reach of harbor, as it becomes not a name, but a sentence that ends with a period. A raider's blade skids off his shoulder plate. The shock travels into his teeth. Harrington turns with the hit rather than against it, and gives back a cut, measured not by anger, but by angle. It lands where armor is honest about being fabric. The man falls with a sound that is both human and the end of something. Harrington does not linger on it. He does not let it eat him. He keeps riding. After, the patrol kneels among the wreckage of speed and judgment. A young retainer bites his lip to stop a noise from escaping. Masatora moves among them with a surgeon's attention. He says little, binding, checking, dismissing what cannot be repaired. To Harrington, he offers water and the look one gives a door that has chosen to stay on its hinges in a high wind. No praise. No condemnation. Just the recognition that the man who returned is not precisely the man who left. In the days that follow, the clan's curiosity loosens its posture. Osaba grunts something that might be approval when Harrington holds the practice square longer than expected against 2 men. The calligrapher corrects his brush grip and finds, to his surprise, that the foreigner's hand now understands the stroke for wick courage without flinching the wrist. The kitchen slips him an extra half-ladle of soup and pretends it didn't. The boy with the water pot graduates to spear drills and still returns sometimes to refill Harrington's cup as if the ritual has a right to continue. Through it all, Harrington keeps his eyes on Masatora. He studies not only the teacher's blade, but his pauses, his refusals, the way he chooses when not to act. He learns that Bushido is not a list recited, but a road walked. Righteousness, courage, benevolence, respect, sincerity, honor, loyalty. Each word is a stepping stone that sinks if you linger. Each expects forward motion. Night brings softer lessons. In the garden, lanterns paint circles on the gravel paths. The Lord's daughter passes once, twice, as duty carries her between wings of the compound. Harrington lowers his gaze in formal courtesy, and she acknowledges him with the kind of exact nod that leaves nothing to rumor. She is an axis around which many stories orbit. Harrington is not yet one of them. That is a lesson too. Desire is not a tool for training. When rain comes, the courtyard becomes a mirror. Drills continue. Feet splash. The sound of wood on wood is gentled by water until it seems the entire world is practicing restraint. Harrington trains until his hands open in thin cuts, and then wraps them in linen and trains again. Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal makes the endurance tangible. A jaw set, then soften it. Eyes that catalog pain and file it where it cannot interrupt the next movement. Masatora eventually returns to the truth that began all this, mercy. He sets another duel, private this time, under a pavilion where rain threads silver curtains. The opponent is not Okabe, not a boy, but Masatora himself. They bow, they begin. The bout is long enough to change weather. It moves from caution to commitment, from pattern to improvisation. Twice Masatora traps the blade called Harbor and lets it go. Once Harrington disarms and refuses to humiliate. The final exchange ends with both men close, both blades poised at the other's exposed truth. They do not finish the line. They step back together, one pace, two. Rain applauds. Masatora's verdict arrives without poetry. You are learning the difference, the translator renders, between winning a fight and earning a place. Harrington bows deeply enough that raindrops lift from his hair and fall in an arc. By the end of this chapter of his life, Harrington has transformed his foreignness from an obstacle into a vantage point. He sees the clan's world, both from within and from a slant that natives cannot. He understands why men obey, why they refuse, why a farmer's courage and a samurai's are the same metal hammered thin for different tasks. He no longer counts days since the shipwreck. He counts lessons until dawn. The prophecy that once sounded like a story men tell to make sense of waves now feels like a knife being honed on a whetstone. Repetition, pressure, intention. Edward Harrington Leonardo DiCaprio's character in this epic stands at the threshold between student and soldier, between tolerated presence and necessary ally. Ahead lie politics with teeth, loyalties that cost, a love that tests the shape of duty, and a fire in which titles are forged. For now, the land accepts him. The honor he seeks is not a crown to be worn, but a burden to be carried. And somewhere beyond the hills, a shogun's general studies maps and asks for the foreigner's name. Love, loyalty, and betrayal. The rains of spring gave way to summer heat, and with it, the fortress of Lord Takeda pulsed like a living art. Markets outside the walls bloomed with silk and salt, merchants crying their wares, while inside the training grounds, Edward Harrington portrayed in this epic by Leonardo DiCaprio, sweat into the dust, his body a map of bruises and hard-earned discipline. He had survived the storm. He had survived contempt. Now he was learning what survival alone could not teach: belonging. The glimpse of grace. It began one evening when the lanterns were lit early, painting the corridors in amber. Harrington carried scrolls from Masatora, his teacher, when he passed through the inner garden. A figure moved there, kneeling by a pond where carp glided beneath lotus leaves. Lady Aiko, daughter of Lord Takeda. Her robe was simple, indigo embroidered with plum blossoms, yet she wore it with the kind of poise that made every petal bow. She was arranging offerings at the shrine: stone incense, water, a folded paper charm. Harrington froze, his shadow flickering against the bamboo screen. He had seen her before, passing from one hall to another, always accompanied, always beyond reach. But this was different. Alone, she looked less like ceremony, and more like a woman carrying the weight of her clan on slender shoulders. She noticed him. Not startled, not offended, merely aware. Their eyes touched for an instant. Harrington bowed, low, precise. Every lesson of respect pressed into that gesture. Aiko inclined her head in return, the acknowledgement exact and nothing more. Yet the air between them lingered. A dangerous thread in the weeks that followed. Fate conspired. Harrington was tasked with escorting the rice convoys that supplied the fortress. On the road, bandits struck with desperation, sharpened by hunger. Harrington's sword, harbor, carved arcs of defense. Arrows sang past his ear. Sweat stung his eyes. When the dust cleared, the convoy was safe, but a stray shaft had found the shoulder of one retainer Iko's cousin. Harrington carried the injured man back to the fortress on his own back, staggering beneath the weight, but refusing to falter. Iko herself came to the infirmary, kneeling beside her cousin, pressing cloth to the wound. Their hands brushed in the exchange of bandages. For the first time, her voice reached him directly. "You fight as if this land is already yours?" she said softly. The translator did not stand close enough to catch it. Harrington only met her gaze and, in broken syllables of newly learned Japanese, whispered, "No, I fight. Because it gave me life." Something unspoken tethered them in that moment, a dangerous thread, fragile and binding. The seeds of betrayal, but not everyone welcomed the foreigner's rise. Okabe, the scarred veteran who had once scorned Harrington, watched the whispers grow like mold in a hidden corner. Harrington's skill was no longer a novelty. It was respect, and respect has a gravity that shifts allegiances. Okabe feared what he could not understand, and fear curdles quickly into envy. Rumors spread that the foreigner sought more than honor, that his eyes lingered where they should not. Iko's name was not spoken outright, but the implication stained the air. The Lord's advisers argued in hushed tones. One insisted Harrington was a divine instrument, proof of prophecy. Another snarled that he was a disease that must be cut out before it spread. Masatora remained silent, though his silence was its own shield. He had seen Harrington's discipline, his refusal to humiliate opponents, his endurance under rain and steel. He would not betray his student, but even his authority could not bind the tongues of jealous men. The Festival of Blades. Every summer, the Takeda clan hosted the Festival of Blades, a demonstration where samurai displayed their mastery before allies and rivals alike. Drums thundered, banners rippled, and the courtyard filled with dignitaries from across the province. This year, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Would the foreigner stand among them? Lord Takeda himself summoned Harrington. "You will fight," the translator relayed, "not as a spectacle. As proof, the match chosen for him was deliberate." Okabe, the veteran, stepped into the arena with eyes alight, his scar twisting into a grin that promised cruelty. Harrington bowed, blade poised. The drums fell silent. The duel was a storm compressed into minutes. Okabe struck with fury, sharpened by months of bitterness. Harrington answered with precision, his movements honed by sleepless nights of practice. Sparks leapt from steel. Sand scattered in arcs beneath their feet. At last, Okabe overreached anger, driving him faster than control allowed. Harrington pivoted, sidestepped, and pressed the flat of harbor against Okabe's throat. Not a killing blow, but a command. The courtyard gasped. Okabe froze. Mercy again. The crowd erupted not in jeers, but in astonished respect. The Lord nodded once, the gesture heavy with approval. Okabe lowered his eyes, defeated not just by skill, but by restraint. And Iko, watching from the veranda, allowed herself the smallest hidden smile. Betrayal in shadow, but mercy is a double-edged sword. That night, while lanterns still smoked from the festival, Okabe drank himself into resolve. His pride shredded, he sought out the rival clan's envoys in secret. If the foreigner was indeed the prophecy, then let him become the spark that set Takeda's fortress aflame. Okabe's betrayal was not loud. It was a letter slipped into the hands of an enemy scout. It was a whispered path through the forest. It was the promise of gates left unguarded at the hour when even soldiers dream. Harrington felt the shift before he knew it. Patrols doubled. The Lord's counselors argued until dawn. Masatora's eyes lingered too long on the horizon. War was coming, not from distance, but from within. A night of confession. On the eve of battle, Harrington found himself in the garden once more, the moon trembling in the pond. Iko stood there, her lantern casting a fragile halo. She turned when she heard his steps, but did not flee. "Tomorrow," she said, "many will die. Perhaps even you." Harrington's throat tightened. He bowed, then raised his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "Then let me speak truth. While breath remains, you have been my guide in silence. In your eyes, I saw the reason I must not fail." Aiko's lips parted, then closed. She stepped forward, close enough that the lantern's warmth brushed against his face. "And in you," she whispered, "I see the impossible honor without birthright. Do not let them take that from you." They did not touch. They did not dare. But the unspoken vow between them was stronger than any embrace. The cliffhanger. The next morning, horns split the dawn. Shadows of enemy banners stretched long against the walls. And within the fortress, the first alarm was not the sound of steel, but the discovery that a gate had been left ajar. Betrayal had opened the door. Edward Harrington, Leonardo DiCaprio's foreign samurai, tightened the straps of his armor and drew Harbor from its scabbard. Ahead lay the battle that would test not only his skill, but his loyalty. For in this land of blood and honor, love was fragile, trust was rarer than gold, and betrayal was always waiting in the dark. Rise to power. The fortress of Lord Takeda breathed in silence before the storm. Dawn spilled across the tiled roofs, painting them in gold, but the sound was wrong. No morning chatter from the market. No playful strike of wooden swords in the courtyard. Only the horns, the long, bone-deep notes that pulled every man from his mat and every woman from her prayers. Edward Harrington, Leonardo DiCaprio's foreign warrior, no longer just a stranger, no longer just a student, tightened the cords of his armor as if he were fastening himself to destiny. Harbor, the sword he had named and claimed, hung steady at his side. Today, his path would either end in the dirt or blaze into legend. Betrayal revealed. Masatora entered the barracks with his calm voice sharpened by urgency. The northern gate, the translator whispered, was left open. "Okabe is gone." The words fell like stones into water. Harrington closed his eyes, and the ripples carried the truth. Betrayal had chosen its mask well. Okabe's pride had always been a blade without a sheath. Now it was pointed at the heart of the Takeda clan. Outside the walls, enemy banners swayed like a forest in the wind, red suns on black fields. Horses pawed the earth. Drums echoed from the hillsides. The rival clan had not come to test, they had come to devour. Lord Takeda ascended the veranda above his men. His voice was iron carried on air. "Today, the gods weigh us. We stand, or we are erased." His gaze lingered on Harrington for a breath longer than expected. No words, just the silent command of trust. Into the fire. The first assault came like a tidal wave. Arrows whistled overhead and buried themselves in walls and flesh. The Takeda archers answered in disciplined volleys, the sky filling with feathers and death. The clash at the northern gate was immediate, furious steel against steel, cries of pain against the drumbeat of war. Leonardo DiCaprio, as Harrington fought shoulder to shoulder with men who had once doubted his right to draw breath beside them. His blade found rhythm not in rage, but in necessity. Cut, step, breathe, cut. Harbor hissed through the air, severing spear shafts, turning aside blades, biting into the gaps where armor lied. Blood sprayed, hot and real, painting the sand he had once trained upon. Okabe appeared in the melee, a ghost of scarred hatred, leading the enemy charge with a stolen banner. His roar was louder than the drums, his betrayal more poisonous than the arrows. He locked eyes with Harrington for a single heartbeat across the chaos, and in that look was a promise. Only one of them would leave this field alive. The turning point hours dragged like years. The Takeda line bent, cracked, threatened to break. Men cried out for water, for brothers, for gods who had gone deaf. Harrington felt his arms grow heavy, his legs rooted in exhaustion. Yet each time he faltered, his gaze found Masatora still standing, precise and unyielding, and Aiko watching from the inner wall, her hands clenched white around the railing. In that moment, Harrington understood. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting for belonging, for honor, for love he could not yet name aloud. When the enemy surged again, Harrington saw the breach before anyone else. A squad of raiders had broken through the southern flank, cutting toward the supply lines. If they succeeded, the fortress would starve before the sun fell. Without hesitation, Harrington shouted, his voice breaking through the din. "With me!" A handful of samurai turned, some out of loyalty, others out of sheer shock that the foreigner commanded at all. Yet they followed. Harrington led them like a river carving its bed. They met the raiders in the narrow pass between the stables and the armory. The clash was brutal, intimate faces close enough to taste each other's breath. Harrington's movements were no longer those of a student mimicking drills. They were instincts sharpened by discipline, mercy tempered by necessity. He cut a path not with fury, but with clarity, his commands crisp, his strikes decisive. By the time the last raider fell, the supply lines still stood, and the men around Harrington stared at him not as an outsider, but as a leader. Duel in the dust, but war as a way of circling back. As dusk bled into the battlefield, Okabe strode into the courtyard like a shadow pulled by gravity. His armor was blackened with soot, his sword dripping with fresh betrayal. "Coward foreigner," he spat, his voice carrying above the clash. "You wear our armor, but you will never wear our honor." The battlefield froze, as if the gods themselves paused to watch. Harrington stepped forward, harbor in hand, his breath steady despite the roar of blood in his ears. The duel began with the fury of history itself. Okabe struck hard, his blade a storm of hatred, while Harrington met him with patience honed through suffering. Sparks leapt with every clash. Their feet tore lines into the earth, their roars mingling with the drums. Okabe feinted high, then low, nearly breaking Harrington's guard. But Harrington adapted, flowing like the sea that had delivered him. He remembered Masatora's lessons: silence, patience, humility. Each strike was measured, each defense born of respect for the steel in his hands. At last, Okabe overextended hatred, pulling him past balance. Harrington turned, caught the blade with a twist, and drove his shoulder forward. Okabe stumbled, his chest exposed. Harrington's sword stopped a breath from his throat. Mercy. Again. The crowd of warriors exhaled as one. But Okabe, true to his poison, lashed out with a hidden dagger. Harrington, quicker, answered with finality. Harbor flashed, and Okabe fell. His betrayal ended in the dirt. The roar of victory, the enemy faltered. Their champion slain, their ranks shaken, the Takeda countercharge thundered forward. Harrington, bloodied and breathless, lifted his blade high. For honor. He shouted not in his native tongue, but in the language he had fought to learn. The men answered, their voices shaking the sky. By nightfall, the rival clan was broken, their banners trampled in the mud, their survivors fleeing into the hills. The fortress still stood, scarred but unbowed. Lord Takeda descended into the courtyard, his eyes never leaving Harrington. Before all gathered men, he raised his hand. Edward Harrington, the translator declared, is no longer an outsider. He is samurai of this house. He has shed blood for our honor. He has carried us from defeat to victory. A roar erupted from the clan cheers, laughter, the striking of blades against shields. Harrington bowed, every lesson etched into his spine, but when he lifted his head, he was no longer a guest. He was a brother, a new place in the world. That night, the fires of celebration burned high. Sake flowed, drums rolled, and songs rose into the stars. Yet Harrington did not sit among the revelers. He stood in the quiet of the garden, where the pond reflected the moon, just as it had the first time he met Aiko's gaze. She appeared, silent as the night, her robe brushing against the stones. "You have done more than survive," she whispered. "You have given us a future." Harrington bowed, but she touched his hand lightly, daring for once to break the barrier of formality. "No," she said. "You gave me one." Their hands parted as quickly as they met, for honor demanded restraint. But in that touch lay a vow stronger than words, stronger even than prophecy. The rise. From that night forward, Harrington was no longer merely a foreigner carried by fate. He was a leader men obeyed, a warrior enemies feared, a figure destiny had carved into the shape of prophecy. Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal of Edward Harrington now shone not as an exile clinging to survival, but as a man rising into power, carrying both sword and honor with equal weight. The storm had delivered him. The prophecy had named him. The battle had proven him. And soon the land itself would bow to him. The final battle. The rains withdrew and left a sharpened world. Hills stood newly etched. Rivers ran quick as drawn blades. Fields, combed by wind, lay waiting for hoofbeats and history. Word had ridden ahead of the army like a rumor with spurs. The shogun's northern general, Lord Kanda, was marching with banners enough to darken the valley and iron enough to change the season. Villages locked their doors. Temples tightened their prayers. The fortress of Lord Takeda gathered breath and did not release it. Edward Harrington Leonardo DiCaprio's foreign-born samurai, no longer apprentice, no longer tolerated, but necessary, climbed to the highest parapet at dawn and looked out over the land that had tested him into belonging. Harbor, the sword he had named, rested against his hip like a promise fulfilled and yet unfinished. Beside him, Masatora studied the same horizon with the same patience a whetstone shows a blade. Below them, men lined spear racks, checked armor lacings, filled powder flasks for the Teppo gunners whose slow thunder could teach even a charging horse new vocabulary. War was arriving with both ceremony and purpose. Kanda's scouts showed the shape of what approached: organized ranks, deep supply lines, signal kites that stitched orders across miles of sky. Not a raid, not a test and ending. The map in the council room was a floor of parchment under heavy hands. Stones marked hills. Brass markers marked cavalry. Thin sticks measured archers' reach. When the Lord asked for counsel, voices braided and unbraided, hold the walls and bleed the enemy in a siege. Sally out and break them before they root. Harrington's voice landed last, not hesitant but deliberate. He proposed a river that ran like a quiet accomplice along the valley's spine, a forest that could become teeth, and a village of thatch roofs that, if lit at the right hour, would turn wind into a weapon. The plan did not depend on bravery alone. It depended on timing, terrain, and the arithmetic of distances that had become his second language. Orders left the room like arrows loosed from a practiced hand. Runners took to the stairs. Drums spoke in code to units scattered across terraces of earth and intent. Under a pale noon, the Takeda army flowed out of the fortress in measured parts. Ashigaru spearmen in ranks that looked like hedges with feet. Samurai in lacquered plates that wore the sun without apology. Gunners with match cords protected under conical covers. Cavalry with lances that promised introduction rather than debate. Harrington rode at the hinge between center and left, where a planned success is often more honest about itself. The armies saw each other fully when the afternoon light stopped hiding. Kanda's banner stood like a field of midnight, with red moons sewn on by a proud and patient hand. Drums hit the skin of the day until it shuddered. Conch shells bayed. Messengers ran like the last thoughts of dead men. The space between forces, that delicate meadow where possibility breathes, narrowed until even possibility had to hold its own spear. Harrington's first gift to the day was shape. He built a crescent with spearmen, whose discipline had been taught by hunger and winter. Behind them, he placed gunners in staggered files, like lines of slow lightning. At the flanks, he hid cavalry among low knolls and whispering bamboo, so that their absence would be noticed before their presence would be understood. In the center, he left a seam as deliberate as a trapdoor, an invitation to a charge that would outrun its own wisdom. Kanda accepted the invitation with the confidence of a man who had rarely met refusal. His vanguard flowed forward, shields up, yari bristling. The ground changed language under their feet, dry grass, to damp, to mud that remembered every hoof that had ever crossed it. And they adjusted with the expertise of men who had marched all their lives. Arrows arced and found leather and lacquer, then arced again and found sky. When the range became honest, Harrington's gunners spoke. Smoke coughed, match cords hissed, men shouldered recoil that traveled into bone, and gaps appeared in the enemy line like missing teeth in a hard-used smile. The first rank fired and knelt to reload. The second stepped over and fired. The third measured out patience and powder, then added their thunder. Kanda's front swayed, and then decided not to fall. They pressed. They always pressed. Contact came like weather. Spears caught the first rush. Ashigaru feet slid and recovered. Men discovered if their stomachs were made of salt or paper. Harrington rode the seam, as if it were a living thing that required touch to remain tame. He sent runners with adjustments that seemed small and proved enormous. 2 paces back on the left to lengthen the angle of a pike wall. 3 paces forward on the right to invite a flanking unit into a mistake. A sudden silence from the gunners to make the enemy wonder if powder had run wet. The line bent, he wanted it to bend, and the enemy poured into the shallow bowl. His formation became crowding themselves, losing a long reach of spear to the short reach of panic. That was when he released the cavalry. They did not explode. They arrived, controlled and surgical, lances angled, hooves choosing clean steps in a field now dirty with intent. They bit into the enemy's shoulders left first, then right, tearing chunks from a formation that had begun the day reciting its own invincibility. The bowl became a jaw. The jaw began to close. Kanda answered with professional's haste. He drove a reserve wedge toward the Takeda center. An iron nail aimed at the seam where Harrington rode. The ground shook with the honesty of so much weight in motion. Harrington saw it come and did not pretend he could stop it with correction alone. He signaled the gunners to hold. He signaled the archers to arc long. He signaled the spearmen to show courage that would have to be remembered by their grandchildren in stories, because so few would survive to tell it themselves. The wedge struck. Men folded. Space became crowded with the end of things. Harrington entered that collapse with a clarity that did not look like courage until later. He dismounted, put the horse into the hands of a boy who was suddenly older, and stepped into the press with harbor held low, a blade that had always preferred work to speech. He cut to create room for breath. He stepped to create room for others' breath. He shouted once, not a command, a location, and men found him as a pivot. Masatora was there too, his sword a line that insisted on geometry in a place obsessed with chaos. For a long minute measured by heartbeats, both men were not heroes, not titles, just practiced answers to bad questions. The wedge stalled. It stalled because the river that Harrington had befriended that morning had been asked a favor at dawn. Movable weirs placed by farmers, who knew water like a blood relative, were shifted under the command of a priest who knew how to ask favors of more than gods. Now the river refused to be a spectator. It rose into the wedge's right flank, subtle and then not. Mud took ankles hostage. The ground punished weight with loyalty to no one. Kanda's shove lost a little of its shoulder. Harrington gave the signal that turned a long battle into a plan advancing to its next page. From the village downslope, the one whose roofs had seemed, until now, to be watching smoke began to climb. Not the black of despair. The gray-white of thatch, planned and lit, and managed by men who had scattered water exactly where flame would ask for it. Wind, which had waited all afternoon like a negotiator, chose a side and carried the smoke across the enemy rear. Visibility narrowed to a tunnel. Lungs complained. In that constrained world, orders misheard themselves. Kites lost meaning. Drums lied by accident. Kanda adapted. Men do not reach his chair without learning to read the day while it is still being written. He contracted his lines, pulled his reserves back into a spine, and sent a fast cavalry group to sweep the ridgeline where he suspected the Takeda archers hid their teeth. He was right. He was also late. The archers were already in motion, repositioning to make their next sentences land on a different page. The cavalry found only old footprints and the kind of silence that costs. Dusk approached, dragging long shadows behind it like nets. Battles decided at dusk are often remembered as destiny, because so little is visible that the story must be told by the survivor's certainty. Harrington looked up and measured how much light the day had left to spend. He ordered the reserve he had hidden past the bamboo men he had taught to move as if grass preferred them into a slanting run aimed not at the enemy front, nor even its side, but the hinge where Kanda's command unit held together conviction and fear. To break that hinge without breaking was the next task. They reached it as torches were being lit. Torches betray. They taught Harrington where the standard-bearers stood, where the message-runners breathed between sprints, where a captain adjusted his helmet cord with the hand of a man who had not slept in 3 nights. He cut through that arrangement the way a river finds a flaw in a cliff, patiently, then all at once. The standard dipped, then toppled. The lines around it stepped back without deciding to. The shout that followed was not language. It was meaning. The hinge had been struck. Kanda himself moved then, as generals must if they intend to keep their name from being spoken with apology. He rode into the failing light in armor, the color of charred wood, and carried a blade with a quiet confidence, a weapon used to closing arguments. He cut a path not through enemies, but through the hesitation of friends, placing himself where a story might find him useful. When he saw Harrington, he saw several things at once. The foreigner rumor had made into prophecy, the practical enemy who had ruined a good day's clean plan, the man poised to turn Takeda's defense into Takeda's ascendance. Kanda's horse shouldered toward him. They met in the ruined center of what had once been order. The men around them stepped back the width of choice, giving steel room to speak. Torches made islands of comprehension in a blackening sea. Harrington lifted harbor and let the breath he had been saving travel down his spine into his heels. Kanda saluted once, not to an enemy, but to the craft of deciding with inches and time. The first pass was a page of straight lines. Test, parry, footwork quiet as apology. The second added punctuation faint high, promise low, deliver narrow. Harrington gave ground and took information. Kanda gave nothing and took breath. The third pass found truth, as third passes insist on doing. Kanda turned a cut at the wrist into a short thrust at the ribs that would have ended a less prepared story. Harrington pivoted on a foot that had learned patience in 100 courtyards and let the blade pass close enough to tell the tale of it to his descendants. He answered with a cut that was less a strike than a correction. Kanda's sleeve opened along a seam no tailor had sewn, and blood made the fabric more honest. They broke. They circled. They met again. Around them the battle continued, refracted through the duel like sound through a bell. Mazatora appeared at the edge of that small world, read it with the ease of a scholar reading a familiar verse, and did the thing a teacher does when a student's exam is being graded by fate. He waited where he could change the outcome from failure to survival, and he kept his own sword, ready to speak only if the grammar of the moment required it. The grammar changed violently. A cluster of Kanda's guards, desperate to rewrite the day, surged into the space where the duel had been given room to breathe. One lunged for Harrington's back. Mazatora's blade wrote the correct answer faster than breath, but there were too many questions. He took the second guard as cut on the rib, were armored to cover a teacher's kindness, and drove his own steel into the third with the intimacy of certainty. Harrington finished the fourth, and then turned to Mazzatorta, because the body knows what matters even when the mind is elsewhere. The teacher stood for a heartbeat longer by design, holding his shape like a sentence concluded. He met Harrington's eyes, and without words, delivered a lesson that in another life would have taken years. There is a cost making a man into more than himself. Then he lowered himself to the ground, the way a banner is folded carefully, with honor, to be carried forward by other hands. Grief made the world very loud and then very focused. Harrington entered a quiet that had nothing to do with sound. He stepped back into the duel with Kanda with the posture of a man who has added one more reason to remain standing. The general read it, because men who live by decision-making learn to read reasons as surely as they read maps. He pressed, fast and without cruelty. Harrington absorbed, redirected, allowed, refused. The exchange widened, then narrowed, and found the scene that decides which name ballads will sing. Kanda lifted for a decisive downward cut, his weight and reputation committed. Harrington slid inside it, posted his left heel in mud and had stopped lying, and drew harbor across the arc where text meets subtext. The general's blade bit earth. Harrington's blade found the place where breath negotiates with blood. The negotiation ended. Kanda fell in stages, as proud structures do when their architect has left the room. He knelt, bowed without meaning to, and became history. Around them, the air changed temperature. The enemy's shout lost its spine. Units that had been 10 became 7. Those that had been 7 became ideas, and then regrets moving toward the dark. Harrington did not lift his sword to celebrate. He signaled, because endings must be made complete by the people who survived to require them. The left flank pressed. The right withdrew 2 paces to let fleeing men escape a trap that would have turned victory into cruelty. The center breathed out, and then in, and remembered it was alive. The river returned to its banks, as if it too understood when drama has served its purpose. By full dark, the valley had finished becoming a place where something irreversible had happened. Fires were lit in patterns that meant safety, not destruction. The wounded were counted by hands that had learned to be gentle late and thoroughly. The dead were named with care, because names are the last blankets we have to offer. Harrington moved through the aftermath, not as a hero enjoys the end of appetite, but as a captain measures the remains of a ship. He checked knots and silences. He gave orders that had to do with water, with watch rotations, with how to carry a man without aggravating what could still be repaired. When he reached Mazzatorta, they had already placed his teacher on a raised plank, washed the blood off the parts of him that belonged to memory, laid his sword along his side, so its presence could continue to explain him. Harrington knelt and placed his forehead to the plank, and did not rush the moment. When he rose, Lord Takeda was there, as leaders must be where grief concentrates. The Lord spoke, and the translator gave the words shape. Mazzatorta had fashioned a blade from a foreign ingot, and tempered it with patience and risk. The blade had held. The blade would now be asked to cut for peace. The Lord's hand, which weighed men like coins and found many light, pressed Harrington's shoulder, and left it there for the duration of a breath he did not share with many. Ceremony found the night, because ceremony is what holds people together as the adrenaline leaves. The army gathered in ranks, uneven with fatigue. Torches stitched orange onto black. The Lord stepped before them, voice steady and unadorned. He named the day, not with boasting, but with inventory, what was lost, what was kept, what had been proven. He turned and faced Harrington, and said the thing that completed the arc of a stranger into a sovereign instrument. Before elders and captains and the watchful dead, he granted him command not of a unit, not of a flank, but of the army that would pursue peace from this victory forward. It was not a title given to flatter. It was weight placed carefully on a back that had demonstrated the will to carry it. The army answered not with frenzy, but with a resonance that traveled through spears and ribs alike. Men who had fallen into step behind him out of surprise earlier in the year now found themselves relieved to do so with intention. The staff officers adjusted their maps to include a new center. The gunners looked at their powder and decided it would be enough. The archers checked bowstrings and made small knots against misfortune. Somewhere in the second rank, the boy who had once brought water gripped his spear and stood taller, because this was the story he would one day tell his grandchildren when winter required long tailies. Later, in the quiet that follows obligation, Harrington returned to the garden whose pond had mirrored so many definitions of himself. The moon rested in the water like a coin lying in an open palm. Steps approached a pattern he had come to know without seeing. Iko stopped beside him, formal distance exact, informal warmth refusing to vanish even now in the presence of ghosts. The night held their silence without impatience. She placed a folded strip of white cloth in his hand. It was inked with a character written in a hand that had memorized brush pressure long before his arrival. Weak courage. It was the stroke she had watched him correct until it became part of how he moved in the world. His fingers closed around the cloth. He did not speak, because victory does not always make space for speech. He set the charm beneath Harbor's bindings so that it would travel where the blade traveled. He breathed in a world that would, for a time, lie still because men had made it so at terrible cost. Dawn came without horns. The valley exhaled. Crows reported without embellishment. Smoke climbed with less urgency. The Takeda standard lifted into newer wind and did not argue. Messengers left with treaties, folded like futures. The first refugees crept back from the woods and discovered that a day can be both haunted and merciful. In the command tent, maps were rearranged so that roads led to markets again rather than to graves. Edward Harrington Leonardo DiCaprio, S portrayal of a man the sea delivered and the land refined, stood in the doorway of that tent and watched ink become intention. He wore grief in one hand and responsibility in the other. The army beyond the canvas belonged to him now, not as property, but as a vow. The enemy he would face tomorrow was no longer a general with a name. It was hunger, revenge, the echo of spilled blood, asking for answers more blood cannot provide. He understood that his next victories must be quieter. Rice planted safely, borders that did not itch, boys who grew to men without learning how heavy a spear feels by carrying it a day too soon. He stepped forward, and the tent accepted his weight. Outside, the land that had called him stranger, the land that had measured, denied, tested, and finally claimed him, waited for the kind of peace that requires as much discipline as war. The final battle had been fought and won. A heavier campaign had begun, and in the still place where a story keeps its heart, the prophecy that once sounded like a riddle now read like a ledger marked paid. The man from beyond the seas had not merely risen. He had accepted the price of rising. From the ridge to the river, from the fortress stones to the silted ford, the valley held a long exhausted silence that sounded very much like hope discovering its voice again. One man's storm became another nation's salvation. Edward Harrington's rise as the samurai king is proof that destiny can rewrite history. But this is only one tale across the world. Countless legends wait to be rediscovered. At Cool Vads, we bring those untold stories to life filled with prophecy, betrayal, triumph, and hope. If this journey moved you, imagine what's next. Just follow or subscribe now to Cool Vads to get updated always in step with us into the next great adventure, where every legend lives again.